Hello and welcome to part one of our lecture series on internal regulation as part of my ongoing series in physiological psychology. This will be the first part of our discussion of internal regulation, which will be about temperature regulations. Part 2 and 3 will be about thirst regulation and hunger regulation. So these are all about maintaining the body's internal processes. But today we're going to talk about how we maintain our internal temperature. We'll start by discussing the differences between homeostasis and allostasis. Homeostasis is how the body strives to maintain its internal environment, and allostasis refers to the adaptive way in which we anticipate needs depending on the situation. And so we oftentimes talk about what's called allostatic load, which is how much our needs are being met or not. And so we talk about how if we are not able to find food and water, then that increases stress levels because we're unable to maintain our homeostatic levels, and so that creates a whole series of problems. We'll talk about temperature regulation, how that works, talk about surviving in temperature extremes, talk about brain mechanisms of temperature regulation, and finally I'll wrap up with discussion of how fever works and why it's important. Let's start with talking about homeostasis and allostasis. First of all, temperature regulation is vital to the normal functioning of many behavioral processes. So we have to have our temperature within a certain range in order for us to behave and act normally. Obviously, if we're too cold, we're too hot, we're not going to be motivated. If we have a fever, it wears our energy levels down. So it's a really important part of our body maintenance. Homeostasis refers to temperature regulation and other biological processes that keep certain body variables within a fixed range. So we're trying to maintain the internal environment within a fixed range. For humans, we have a relatively narrow range of temperatures at which we can survive, and certainly an even narrower range at which we are comfortable. And so it's a really important distinction to make in terms of survival and comfort level. We also, of course, have other homeostatic processes that maintain the amount of water, the amount of salt, our body pH, the amount of protein in our blood, sugar in our blood. All these are part of different homeostatic processes. As part of this, we have set points, which refer to single values that the body works to try to maintain. And so when we talk about homeostasis, we're trying to maintain a body temperature around 98.5 degrees, right? Not 98.6. Everyone's set point is a little bit different. The average is right there at about 98.6. Some people are more closer to 98.4 or up to 98.7 as we get older. Our body temperature starts to decline a little bit, so we start to feel colder more often. Set points also exist for levels of water, salinity, oxygen, glucose, calcium, protein, fat, and acidity. So we try to maintain these within a certain range. And if we go outside of those ranges, we can have certain physical problems and certainly a lot of psychological problems. So for example, if the pH in our blood is outside of its normal value, we can have digestive issues and a sudden and dramatic decline in cognitive functioning. And so it's important to try to maintain within these set points. Processes that reduce discrepancies from the set point are known as negative feedback. So whenever we are outside of our range, we try to feedback and bring us back towards our set point. So for example, if you have your thermostat set in your house at 70 degrees and we exceed that value, then the air conditioning comes on, which tries to cool it. So that's a negative feedback because it's trying to push it back away from its value. Similarly, if we drop below, the thermostat drops down to 65 degrees, the heat will come on and try to push it back towards its value. Allostasis refers to the adaptive way in which the body anticipates its needs depending on the situation. So in this way, we are trying to anticipate our need for water, our need for food, and thereby drive us or motivate us to go out and find food and water. It's also why we try to maintain oxygen. So it's the adaptive way in which we anticipate needs depending on our situation. So I want to talk next about temperature regulation. We'll talk how we control temperature. We'll talk about poikilothermic species, which are those whose body temperatures match those of their surrounding environment, and homeothermic species like us who maintain a fairly precise body temperature through a variety of processes. And then we'll finish up with a discussion of basal metabolic rate. because it's an important part of understanding things like fitness and diet and exercise, and it's primarily driven by temperature regulation. So temperature regulation is one of the body's biological priorities. In fact, maintaining temperature requires twice as much energy as all other activities combined. So when we're talking about how much energy the body is using, we're generally talking about maintaining our body temperature. And so that's one of the reasons why we focus on something like basal metabolic rate. So we can regulate our body temperature by increasing our internal energy use, by adding heat, or by heat loss. You have to remember thermodynamics. That is, you can only add heat or take heat away. So that is, you can add more heat or give off more heat. Those are the only ways in which the body can regulate temperature. We can't make things more cold or less cold. We can only add heat or give off heat. So adding heat, we increase our energy use, which increases the sort of burning of fuel and increases temperature. We can lose heat by convection, conduction, radiation, and evaporation, and we're going to talk more about those here in a bit. Basal metabolism then refers to the energy used to maintain a constant body temperature while at rest. So this is our basic metabolic rate. So it's basically how we maintain our body temperature while we're sitting around doing nothing, and we call this our basal metabolic rate, which is the amount of energy expressed in calories that a person needs to keep the body functioning at rest. This is an important piece of information to have because it tells you how many calories you're burning just sitting around doing nothing and not exercising. And so anything you can do to alter your basal metabolic rate will alter your caloric intake need, or how many calories you're burning any given day just by sitting around. So, for example, if you want to increase your basal metabolic rate and burn more energy, we'll talk about how to do that. There are also things that can cause your basal metabolic rate to reduce and thereby cause you to burn less calories, and one of those is aging. As we get older, our basal metabolic rate starts to slow down, and as a result, we oftentimes have to change our dietary intake. So we'll first talk about poikilothermic or ectothermic species. These are species whose body temperature matches that of their environment. So amphibians, reptiles, and most fish. So these species lack the internal physiological mechanisms of temperature regulation, and so simply take on the temperature around them. So temperature regulation is accomplished by choosing locations in the environment. Snakes will come out and sun themselves. They'll find shade to get cooler. All they can do is change their environment to try to change their temperature. We call these cold-blooded animals, but they're only cold if their environment is cold. So it's really kind of somewhat of a misnomer to call them cold-blooded animals, but they certainly don't actively maintain a warm environment like we do. So we are always warm-blooded, for example. Homeothermic, or what we call endothermic species, we use internal physiological mechanisms to maintain an almost constant body temperature. This is characteristic of mammals and birds. Certainly requires energy and fuel. So sweating and panting are ways in which we can decrease our temperature. We can increase our temperature by shivering, decreasing blood flow to the skin, and fluffing out fur to increase insulation. This is what gives us those goosebumps that we talk about when you get sort of raised bumps on your flesh. That is your body trying to fluff out your fur that you no longer have. And so there's a little bit of trivia there. And so basically the way in which we increase our temperature is by increasing the amount of energy we're burning via shimmering and decreasing heat loss. And so we decrease heat loss by decreasing blood flow to the skin. So it's no longer, we're not exposing it to the atmosphere as much, and fluffing out our fur to increase the amount of insulation. We, of course, no longer have fur, but this is what animals do. So some important factors that influence our basal metabolic rate. So measuring basal metabolic rate requires complete rest, and we often then measure what we call resting metabolic rate, because basal metabolic rate is trickier. So we talk about resting metabolic rate. It's by far the largest component of total caloric expenditure. So if you're talking about trying to get fit or trying to lose weight or trying to understand weight loss, basal metabolic rate is an important component. And the first thing to understand is that caloric restriction can potentially reduce basal metabolic rate, certainly if it's done over the long haul. Evidence is mixed in terms of limited um, periodic caloric restriction. There's some evidence that a single day of fasting can be good for us, or certainly fasting for part of the day. There are lots of religions that have this as part of their religious experience, and there's a reason why it has developed into such a long-standing practice, as it does seem to be associated with health and potentially even mental health. But overall, caloric restriction, so daily caloric restriction over the long haul, which is what a lot of people do when they diet, can actually reduce your basal metabolic rate. One of the other things that can happen is if people have long-term drug abuse issues and end up with caloric restriction because of that. So, for example, people who use methamphetamines simply have no interest in eating, and so when they come off of those drugs, their metabolic rate is very, very low, and as a result, their body stores a lot of fat, and so you end up with some huge disruptions in weight because of that. The best way to increase your metabolic rate is to increase muscle mass. In fact, it is about the only way to increase your metabolic rate. Increasing your cardiovascular fitness, while is important for other reasons, it will actually not increase the rate at which you burn calories. You'll burn more calories while you're doing it, but increasing muscle mass will actually increase your basal metabolic rate, and so you'll burn calories throughout the day. And so it's actually an incredibly important part of a weight loss program is an increase in muscle mass, because then you're burning calories all day long. And so it's an incredibly important part of this picture. So basal metabolic rate reduces with age. As we get older, we need to start eating less. In fact, for men, this starts in the late 20s and early 30s. You will suddenly have a decline in basal metabolic rate, and will suddenly notice that what you had been doing all along to maintain your physique no longer works. And so again, that's late 20s, early 30s, and this is when people dramatically can suddenly undergo pretty dramatic body changes. And so keep in mind that this is a normal aging process. What you have to do is increase your fitness level a little bit and decrease your caloric intake. So older adults often report feeling cold as they engage in less thermogenesis with reduced metabolism, so they're not generating as much internal heat because their metabolic rate is reducing. And so this is one of the reasons why older adults oftentimes feel so cold, is because their metabolic rate has reduced so much. I wanted to talk a little bit about surviving in extreme temperatures, just because I think this is a really interesting bit of trivia, really, and has some important components for us in terms of what our ability to survive in extremes are. But this is the Arctic tree frog. It can survive being completely frozen for 7 months. What appears to happen is they start to adapt to a freeze-thaw cycle, so they are basically frozen and thawed out each day for several weeks, which might help them prepare for winter. What happens is they convert massive amounts of glycogen into glucose, which keeps their blood cells from dehydrating, so their blood cells don't rupture. And that's what happens when we have frostbite. We have cells that rupture because they dehydrate, which has something to do with the glycogen levels. And so converting it into glucose keeps those blood cells from dehydrating and keeps them intact. For humans, a core temperature of less than 35 degrees Celsius or about 90 degrees Fahrenheit is considered hypothermia. Blood vessels in the skin and muscles will contract to protect our core temperature, and so the body is trying desperately to maintain that core temperature. Frostbite will occur from dehydrated cells, which is caused by freezing of the extracellular water in the skin. So you can look at this hypothermia symptoms at our normal body temperature. We start to feel cold, a couple degrees below that. We'll start shivering. Then we'll start to get clumsy, confused, and start to develop amnesia. This happens pretty quickly. There isn't a whole lot of variance in this. So once we're down to our core temperature drops below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, we start getting clumsy, confused, amnesia. Our muscles will get stiff. We can end up with muscle contractions and collapse and be unable to move. We'll then probably move into the semi-conscious coma stage. We'll then get to a slower heart rate and breathing, and then death. Now this is a very bizarre part of human physiology, but certainly children have been known to get to the point where their heart rate and breathing are not measurable, and yet when they're warmed back up, their body comes back around. For adults, there's less success with that, but certainly we talk about nobody is cold and dead until they're warm and dead, because once they warm up, their heart rate and breathing may become registerable again. And so it's an important part of understanding how this all works. That is, once people start to warm up again, they oftentimes will come back around. Now, of course, it doesn't solve frostbite problems and all sorts of other issues, loss of oxygen to the brain, etc. But you can survive being very cold. So in terms of extreme heat, heat exhaustion to lead to heat stroke or hyperthermia. Anything above about 105 degrees Fahrenheit would be considered hyperthermic in an adult. Can be caused by exertion, insufficient cooling, which is often caused by protective equipment. So, for example, firefighters can have some heat exhaustion. Certainly soldiers and sailors can as well, because of the amount of equipment that they're required to have. The treatment for hyperthermia is rapid cooling, and just as rapid as you can do it, cold ice water is the best treatment. So when the external temperature is greater than the body, the only option for the body is to increase evaporation. So one of the other things to watch out for is dehydration and hyponatremia, which are major risk factors of heat. So to summarize this, if someone is hyperthermic, that is, they have a very high fever, show headache, dizziness and confusion, or nausea and vomiting, the number one priority in a heat stroke victim or a heat exhaustion victim is to get their core body temperature down. And so ice packs, particularly under their armpits, genitals, everywhere you can get them where there's a lot of blood flow, is what you want to do, because you want to try to get their body temperature down. Now, the other issue with extreme external temperature is our body's obviously trying to maintain a lower body temperature through evaporation, and it does that through our lungs and obviously through sweating. And as a result, we can end up with loss of water and loss of salt, which is hyponatremia. So we want to be very careful and mindful of those. Drink lots of water, and in some cases, you want to make sure you're drinking something like Gatorade, or certainly eating some sort of food that includes salt. A lot of marathons now have scales along the route, because what happens is oftentimes people will end up with water intoxication because they will overconsume water, because they will overestimate the amount of water they have sweat out, and as a result they'll end up flushing all the salt out of their body, and so that's what that hyponatremia is. And as a result, they can have heart attacks. And so marathons now have people weigh themselves as they're going through the race course to determine whether or not they've lost water or gained water, and as a result they'll know whether or not they should drink more. So there are some obviously brain mechanisms that control temperature regulation. We'll talk about the preoptic area and the anterior hypothalamus, talk a little bit about the immune system, and then finish up with drugs and thermoregulation. The preoptic area and the anterior hypothalamus are areas particularly important for temperature regulation, so it's predominantly dependent on those areas. The preoptic area and the anterior hypothalamus receives input from temperature receptors throughout the body. Heating at the preoptic area and anterior hypothalamus leads to panting or sweating. Cooling, it leads to shivering. And important to understand that this part of the brain receives input from the immune system. The immune system releases cytokines, which then causes the release of prostaglandins, and those prostaglandins cause the preoptic area and anterior hypothalamus to try to increase the body's temperature to try to create a fever. So you can see here, we're talking about this preoptic area and the hypothalamus. If you get down to the much smaller area, the anterior hypothalamus is here, and the preoptic area is here. These are very tiny areas, and they receive, again, input from the immune system. So the immune system delivers prostaglandins and histamines, which can cause shivering, increased metabolism, and fever. Again, all these are increasing body temperature. People often will feel cold even though they're not cold. That's what causes the shivering, and basically it's the fever kicking in. And so after the shivering will often be when a fever spikes. It's important to understand that this is not the only area involved in temperature regulation, but it is the primary area for controlling sweating or shivering. And so this is an important part of that process. But again, the immune system is delivering prostaglandins and histamines, and these can then cause that increase in metabolism and fever. Certain drugs can also affect thermoregulation. Cocaine, methamphetamine, and ecstasy, or MDMA, all increase body temperature by increasing basal metabolism and by limiting heat loss through vasoconstriction. So we oftentimes see increased internal temperature in these people. If we add to that the drug abuse environment, so things like raves or nightclubs that are hot, people are sweating, lots of people standing around that are over hot, and the major side effect here is brain hyperthermia. We'll talk in the next lecture on thirst satiety, about how ecstasy can actually influence the thirst satiety system and convince people they need to keep drinking water until they get hyponatremia. So the final thing to discuss here on temperature regulation is fever, which reflects an increased body temperature set point. This is directed by the hypothalamus. The immune system triggers an increase in prostaglandins, which causes an increase in inflammation and temperature. The benefits of fever are it causes certain bacteria to grow less vigorously, and then the immune system works more vigorously. So this is the way in which we can get the body to try to get over an infection. So it is an important part of the process, but it can be dangerous. So fever above about 103 degrees does the body more harm than good, particularly in adults. Anything above 109 degrees is life-threatening. Anti-pyretic drugs, which are those that decrease fever, are things like acetaminophen and ibuprofen. They are cyclooxygenase inhibitors, which reduces the production of prostaglandins. Cyclooxygenase is an enzyme which helps to produce prostaglandins, and so by decreasing cyclooxygenase, you decrease the release of prostaglandins. Acetaminophen seems to have more of an effect on fever, and ibuprofen more of an effect on inflammation. Acetaminophen has very weak anti-inflammatory properties, where ibuprofen has very strong anti-inflammatory properties. These all fall under the category of what we call NSAIDs, which are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. They have varying effects, but acetaminophen seems to be the most effective for fever, ibuprofen more effective, as well as naproxen for reduction of inflammation. Important to understand that these drugs do have side effects. Ibuprofen and naproxen have pretty significant gastrointestinal issues, and acetaminophen has a certain level of hepatotoxicity. And so if you're trying to get over a hangover after a night of drinking, I don't recommend acetaminophen. Your liver's already trying to get through the day as it is. Adding acetaminophen will only increase that damage to the liver. All right, well, that's our discussion of temperature regulation. We'll talk next about thirst regulation.